So if we were to analyze the first two chapters, this is what he does in his book. He says, if we were to take a look at the first two chapters, we would find two results. The first one is that anxiety is a matter of the dialectic goal, which by that he means is a logical discussion of opposing ideas. So dialectical means a logical discussion of opposing ideas. So anxiety is a matter of that discussion, is in a relationship between the self and the other. So that's the anxiety. We seek validation. Subcategories to that is we seek validation of the self and the other by the difference in the other. So we look to another person, we see them as different than us, and we get back some kind of we're seeking to find some kind of validation in the other person, some kind of a reflection that reinforces the idea that we really do exist here. We know that there's a difference, so we know that it is another self. This creates the sense of alienation from the other and ourself, a sense of isolation. So we see the other person, we recognize human characteristics and human traits in them, we see ourselves in them, but at the same time, we still know there's a significant difference. There's an isolation between us. So like between Luke and I, when we converse, when we talk, when we see each other, we see similarities, but we also know Luke's Luke and I'm me. So we see that isolation. And the anxiety that's created here is attention. So an explanation of what that means, what's attention. The self seeks itself in another. And in this case, it's an indeterminate other, which is a vagueness. If we seek ourselves in something, how can he put it here? Something that's vague, something indeterminate, not necessarily a person, let's say something. It becomes dreaming anxiety, is what he calls it. In other words, it's not fully there. We don't really see ourselves fully reflected. So we don't really know that we exist for sure exactly as we are. So there's this indeterminate vagueness about who we are when we look in something other than another human being, let's say. So we have also the objective anxiety, which is what we project into non-humans. So when we see, like we talk about teddy bears and dolls and things like that, or we can even talk about nature. We can reflect certain human characteristics of ourselves from non-human entities. It's a projection, I think psychologists would call it, to project ourselves in these other things. So Kierkegaard calls that objective anxiety. And then subjective anxiety, which was we see the self in a human other. A reflection of ourselves is better, or at least clearer, in a person than in a non-human or an indeterminate something. So we've got these three types of anxieties. The dreaming anxiety is when we reflect ourselves in something, but it's not very clear. So we really don't get the feedback we want. So we're still in that dreamy state about being who we are. Then we have the objective anxiety, which comes about from projecting our human existence onto other things, onto even other beings, even into animals. Perhaps this is a source of animism, right? And subjective anxiety, which is reflecting ourselves finally into something more clear, into another human being. So we have that subjective anxiety. Now, those are difficult things to explain. Is there anything you want to say on that? Did anything make any sense, or didn't make any sense?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good again.
No, I think I'll go along with a lot of it. I mean, I think I would, I think I would you know, we're on installment 6 of this, so I don't want to get too hung up on a lot of things, but I think the only thing I would do if I were to sort of like enter in an encyclopedia definition of these things, which, you know, obviously someone needs to do, is I may quibble with the how much of the objective anxiety is projected onto non-human nature and how much of it actually is in there. And this goes back to issues about the entire fall of creation with Adam. I think in this particular chapter, I think that that reading is more appropriate, and it seems to be the one that you've talked about here, that about as projecting on the human nature, or non-human nature, I should say. I guess the only thing I really worry about, and I don't know if we would ever really know, because we can't really get out of our abilities to observe nature to know whether or not it's in it or projecting it, sort of conundrum that has inhibited a lot of philosophers. I guess I'm a little bit concerned about the idea of subjective anxiety being predicated on a human other. It seems like to me that you would have subjective anxiety without a perceiver other than yourself. At least that's how, you know, I understood it when I was studying it a little bit more closely. It seems like we've made a little bit of a shift there.
We did.
To say that the anxiety is somehow predicated on other people's eyes.
But I don't think he's giving us an exclusive definition here. I think he's just saying subjective anxiety happens when we do this. Not necessarily this is the only time it happens. So you can have an inward reflection and that's what he talked about earlier. Adam had an inward reflection, I think, as well. I would have called that subjective anxiety. So he kind of uses it there and he uses it here, but I think he's just saying here it happens when this happens rather than only when this happens.
Right. So dreaming spirit is the subjective anxiety that only Adam had, right? Because we get it
at first, right?
Right. So he had that before Eve came. Yeah. But did he? I guess the question is: was Adam's subjective anxiety in existence before the creation of Eve?
Yeah, we don't know, but could have theoretically. Let's see. Theoretically, I guess it could have been.
I think it could have. I think it could have been too. So that's I mean, an interesting thing to talk about. I don't know why these chapters have been so difficult for me. So I'll just.
Oh, that me too.
Yeah, I feel like I've probably struggled more with these 15 or 20 pages of Kierkegaard than anything we've ever done before.
Well, you've got a lot of other stuff going on too. I have pretty much tried to focus on this, so that's helpful for me. So then we could talk about the consequence of historical relationship. How's our time? Do we have a little time left? Or
we keep going.
We're good? Okay.
I didn't think that we would get to this section today, so
okay.
But I think it's short.
We don't have a lot left. Yeah,
it's short. So why don't you go ahead and finish it off, and then I'll pick it up there next week.
Now he gives us this is section B, the consequence of the historical relationship, and the way I got the sense when I was reading it, these were like bullet items he was firing away at me. They didn't always seem to flow from one idea into the next. It was just like he just threw some things at us. So I'll just mention what I wrote down. It says, when we talk of the historical relationship, we're speaking about the race and its history. So we did kind of discuss that at one time. What was the historical? Well, he's talking about that as the race and the history of the race. So procreation, so to speak. We don't say that's, and then another item here is that we don't say that sensuousness is sinfulness, but that sin makes it sinful. So sensuousness, being beautiful, looking at a beautiful woman, appreciate the beauty of a woman or the beauty of a man, if so, is not sinful. It's only sinful when sin makes it sinful. So in and of itself, it's okay. Then he says there's a relationship between the sensuous and the freedom that brings about an anxiety. but he's not specific about it. He doesn't tell us much more. He says that there's a fear that we might be drawn into sin by the sensual. So the anxiety created by the sensual is that, you know, this could go further than just a friendly look. You know, what's the potential here? And in order to do that, we have to look into freedom of the future. In other words, what could happen? What could unravel from this? What could be the cause of this? And that creates an anxiety. So that's the freedom of the future. The individual who has anxiety about sin brings about more sin. The tension in the form of temptation overcomes the resistance to sin, and it makes us feel guilty. Now, we'll see he's kind of getting into a biblical principle here about the idea that if you think it's sin, it is sin. He's not yet really defined sin other than through the implication that it's kind of a disobedience. But that doesn't seem to really fit here when he talks about sex and how you could be drawn into sin. Disobedience doesn't seem to play into that factor. So how does sexuality create disobedience? And my answer to it was only if it creates independence through something taken as more important than faith. So when the sexual rises above your faith, it becomes sin. When it becomes, and how does it do that? It becomes more important than faith. So this is the idea that seek the kingdom of God first above all things, and everything else will be added unto you. If the kingdom of God isn't first, and sexuality gets up there higher than our sense of God's righteousness and God's kingdom, then it becomes sin. So that's how I would say what he's trying to say here. But that's my take on it from my Christian point of view. But let me continue on first before I ask you for your feedback on it, because I want to give you a little more input. Because now he talks about that conscience. He says the individual who's in anxiety, not about being guilty, but about being considered by others to be guilty, becomes guilty. So if you're worried about other people thinking you're guilty, that could cause you to be guilty. An example might be if a woman is considered guilty of sin because she doesn't wear a veil, she begins to feel guilty about not wearing a veil and therefore will wear the veil. And when she takes the veil off, she feels guilty of sin because everybody tells her she's guilty of sin. So this is how the conscience plays a role in here. So one becomes guilty when he perceives himself or herself guilty. So if sensuousness is against our conscience, then it does become sinful. So we can make sensuousness guilty. If somebody says to you, if you belong to a religious culture that says to look upon a woman, then see her face and think she's beautiful, that's a sin, and you grow up believing that. When you look upon a woman and see her face and think she's beautiful, you think you've committed a sin and you need to repent for it. So we see that all over in a lot of religious, that we create sin by attacking the conscience, through the conscience. Now, this comes actually from 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 7 through 13. And I'll read that because it's worth reading. However, and this is Paul writing to the church of Corinth. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge, for some with consciousness of the idol until now eat it as a thing offered to an idol. He's talking about eating food offered to idols. So he's saying those people who don't realize that it doesn't mean anything having an idol because there's really no other God other than the true God. What happens if he eats the food? So he says, not everyone has that knowledge. For some with consciousness of the idol, until now it is as a thing offered to an idol. and their conscience being weak is defiled. But food does not condemn us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. But beware lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to the idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died? But when you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I'll never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So you kind of get onto that passage. I know you got to have a context to that, but that's the idea that even eating food offered to an idol can create a sinful attitude in a person if their conscience is educated in that way. So we kind of can create that sinfulness. So now we get into nature, back to nature or nurture. Hoffniensis here states that we can't say that a child is either good or bad, but he has the potential to become both guilty and innocent. So that's kind of one of those bullet items. Do you kind of agree with that? I think he's approaching the nature-nurture argument there, saying that a child isn't born good or bad, but they both every child has the potential to become guilty or innocent. You think so?
Well, every child will become guilty and every child will leave innocence behind. I think the question is whether or not they will become good or bad, depending on the decisions that they have once they eat of the knowledge of fruit of good and evil. So I would say that it is up to us whether or not we become virtuous or bestial. But as far as guilty and innocence, that's inevitable for every individual, as far as I understand. Like, there's no way for innocence to be preserved or guilt to be avoided. Every human will lose innocence and become guilty just as a result of the developmental process. But whether or not they become, what they do from that point onward, I think is up to their control.
Yeah, so you might say how they sin is something that is developed. Right. Whether they sin or not is not necessarily embedded in them, but how they live out that sinfulness is probably more DNA, more brain structure, and so forth. Could certainly be influenced, to violence or to whatever, or upbringing and all those factors, right?
Yeah, but I mean, ultimately, I don't think you want to do away with agency. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some nature and nurture that affect both of those things, but ultimately, there's accountability with the individual. I don't think Kierkegaard wants to explain it away entirely with nature or nurture. But like I said, I didn't prepare this section as much, so I'm just kind of drawing on the corpus of Kierkegaard.
No. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate your feedback. So now he talks about selfishness. He says, is selfishness sin? Right? He agrees that there is a relationship between the two, but it is one where sin causes selfishness rather than sin is selfishness. So selfishness, my own note here is one cannot have true faith and selfishness at the same time. Faith comes through selflessness. It's the ability to trust one another and, of course, eventually trust God. Selfishness is a sign of a weak faith and therefore would be sin. So what do you think of that?
It's fine. I think the thing that I'm curious about is this whole idea that sin is something that can be manufactured by culture. You see an example of stealing the food from the idol, or the woman who's not veiling herself properly, or something like that. I don't, the way that I think about sin in Kierkegaard is that it can't be socially constructed. that like I'm struggling to think about what exactly sin is and stuff like that, but I'm not necessarily I'm not necessarily sure that we sin if we violate a culture's mores.
Well, let me throw it out this way. Let me reword it a little bit. What I think he's telling us is that sin, at least St. Paul is telling us, that sin is a matter of faith. So if you do something against your conscience, what you're doing is you are violating your faith.
I would agree with that.
Okay? It's not that it becomes sin because we say it's sin. It's not the act that becomes sin. It's the violation of our faith that makes it sin.
Right. But I would say conscience, there's a difference between like pure sort of ethical conscience that we can sort of rationally get a hold of, and then conscience that's sort of been distorted and manipulated by the society that we grow up in.
Absolutely.
So I would agree with it if we define it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
and now,
right, because if you grow up in a society that says that it's wrong to treat women nicely, and I go and violate it by treating women with kindness, I don't think I've committed a sin.
Right, and that's exactly right. That's the danger of self-righteousness, is we live by the custom of what they consider sin, void of faith, because faith isn't in God, it's in the system. And you've now put your faith in somebody or some system or some religion even that's going to tell you what to do, what not to do. And beating women is good for them. It teaches them their place and so forth. So when you grow up, you think, well, I'm a righteous man because I beat my wife. Well, that's not too good in the eyes of God, really. So I agree with you there. All right, now let me wind up here. I got a couple paragraphs here. This is what I was working out yesterday when I told you I kind of woke up about 3 in the morning, and I thought, maybe this is an aberration, or maybe I actually am beginning to understand Kierkegaard. So I think, what he's basically saying is that Adam lived in the moment without any knowledge of the past, present, or the future. At some time, he became aware of the future, which brought about concern for what might come about. In other words, the possible. So the future relates to what's possible. The concern for the unknown he calls anxiety, subjective anxiety. So this concern, which actually develops into anxiety, comes about because of the possibility that comes about from his understanding of the future. But at this time, he did not act upon his fear. In other words, this is prior to his sinfulness. He was there in that state of innocence, yet anxiety. It wasn't until Eve presented him with a chance for knowledge of good and evil. This may have been a way for Adam to consider, how can I get rid of this anxiety of the unknown? In other words, when we're in a state of innocence and we think the future, we don't know what the future is going to bring. We're kind of afraid of it. But if we can have knowledge of good and evil, maybe that will get rid of my feeling of anxiety. And his eating of the fruit was a result of all these forces working upon him. So the underlying reason that it was a sin is because instead of trusting God with the future, he took it into his own hands to avoid having the anxiety. So this is kind of how, and then we're going to talk about it in the next chapter, a little bit more about the future and the time and the present. So I'm kind of putting in a little bit of what I've read ahead into that. But this is kind of how I'm looking at that, how it played out with Adam, that he had anxiety, which he was trying to eliminate by getting the knowledge of good and evil. And by doing that, it was a violation of faith in God by saying, no, Adam, trust me, it will take care of itself. And he said, no, I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to take care of it right now with this knowledge of eating. So did I do any good here, or did I miss the point?
I think that's that the dots connect on that.
Okay.
I think the dots are connected on that.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'm trying to think what would be still mysterious after our conversation and trying to look back on everything that we've said that may have been contentious is, you know, what can we say anything about anxiety that happens after his first sin? Did we answer that question?
Well, it's a different anxiety. Yeah, because the first anxiety is between innocence and guilt, which he no longer has. It's just between guilt and guiltier. Yeah.
Right.
But the Christian has a different anxiety where he goes back to that innocent guilt kind of thing in the beginning until he matures, and then he puts his faith in God above everything. And so he eliminates the anxiety in perfection.
I just have a feeling, I don't know how it all works out, and maybe we'll understand it as we get more through the book, is that, you know, like in the sickness unto death, right?
Yeah.
The sickness unto death, there's unconscious despair, there's conscious despair, which then like breaks down into like despair over, it breaks down to a multiplicity of different types of despairs, right? And I'm just kind of wondering if anxiety does the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. Is that if we end up with having, like we had like 5 or 6 different types of despair, we would end up having 5 or 6 different types of anxiety. The thing is, it seems like we're going from the idyllic Edenic state, fall, then right to Christianity. I think there's some stuff that happens in between that we don't really fully grasp yet.
There might
That's
be.
all I'm saying.
Yeah, he does talk in what would I, and then not in graduated things. He talks in, I can't think of that word again, quantum. He's kind of speaking in stages. So one stage you jump into the next, a leap. There's not much that happens in his life, in his world, that is incremental. It's usually in these stages, like stages of life and so forth. He doesn't really discuss what happens in between. So hopefully we'll find out.
I want to know what that is. I think that's the big mystery for me. I wonder if we sorted out all the male female stuff. I think maybe we'll see.
I think we made a dent in it. I'm not sure we answered all the questions, but I think we made a dent in it. We redeemed him a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. All right. Well, I think we've gone as far as we possibly can today. I mean, I imagine we're over an hour again here. Sorry for the crappy internet connection. I don't know how terrible my voice was for that during that spot, but
it was about 5 minutes, if even that long. It wasn't that long.
Okay. Yay, Southern living, rural living. All right. Well, I'll bring this one to a close, and I'll put it up on the app, and we'll just keep making headway. Okay. All right. Thank you, Bob.
Bye-bye.